So today we're really excited. Again, my name is Lori Ruffin with the V3 Movement, and we're really excited to have with us today as our guest, Brandon Rencher. He's a speaker, writer, and group facilitator within faith education and the nonprofit sectors. He is the architect of the Good Neighbor Movement, and is currently leading the faith community in downtown Greensboro. He has been to Duke Divinity and has a master's in theology. And he's an active participant with the V3 Church Planting Movement, the CCDA, Christian Community Development Association, the Rural Advancement Foundation, and many other organizations. He's married to Erica, our co-guest, who is Erica Rencher, who is a public educator, a speaker, a vocalist, an activist working with schools, churches, and neighborhoods to build beloved communities. She is a high school history teacher in North Carolina, and she's passionate about mobilizing students to make connections between the past and the present so that they can realize their responsibility in bending the shape of history towards justice and peace. She holds a Bachelor in Arts in History and a Master of Arts in teaching from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She enjoys being with her family, drinking good wine, and she's married to her best friend, Brandon. And so we're really glad that they are here today as guests to really speak to us about the topic of multi-ethnic missional planting. Along with us, we also have Dan White Jr., who co-planted Axiom Church, Syracuse, in Syracuse, New York. He is a strategist with the V3 movement and really just a critical part of the V3 movement. He co-founded the Praxis Gathering, which is a conference that we do each year as the V3 movement to bring practitioners to explore mission, discipleship, and reimagine leadership for those of us who are in the space of church planting. So without further ado, we're going to jump in, but we just want to give everybody a hearty welcome. One thing I will note is that something that's really excited about the Renchers is that they are a part of the learning cohort, the V3 learning cohort, which is a year-round cohort that does a deep dive into missional planting. And so I will take this as a time to, as the slide is coming up, it's 8 months of training on grounded missional practice. And we are actually coming to the end of the time where we receive applications for the following year. So if you or someone that you know is a church planter who's interested in equipping and more training, I just want to invite you to go to the v3movement.org, the-v3movement.org, and apply before we close this year's session. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to the Renchers, and then we'll conclude our time today by tackling any questions that you have. So one last time, if you have any questions as they are sharing, please drop that into the Q&A session of the Zoom call, and we will field your questions at the end of today's call. Thanks so much. The Renchers.
Hi, everybody. I'm so thankful to be here. So we'll just go ahead and get right into it, so we can make sure we have as much time for interchange at the end. Want to make clear that we're not covering everything. People have buku degrees on this kind of stuff, and we don't even claim to be the end all, know all. And so we just want to make clear that we're not gonna cover everything. Our goal is really to amplify a significant tension within multi-ethnic church plants, and that tension being colonialism. We want to really expose a pathway that leads us to more faithful place, and that place is community. So just want to make that clear. Also, one other note: we'll be using multi-ethnic and multicultural interchangeably. Theoretically, the two are different, but in the field, we know practitioners use these terms interchangeably, and in terms of referring to a high value on diversity. So it depends on what the context is, what that designation of diversity might look like. Is it race? Is it class? Is it style, worldview, etc.? So those two notes. And yeah, so we are going to be in three main phases for the session during our speaking part, and then we'll get into Q&A. So the first part, we're going to be talking about where we're going and a vision. The second part will go into where we are right now. And then third part, we will end off with how we're getting to where we're going back to that number one. So yeah, so if you're like me and you're taking notes, three main points. So where we're going, a vision of liberation community. You're gonna hear that phrase, because that's the phrase that we are kind of calling the community that God, we believe God is calling us to. And we're gonna begin here with God's vision. And we're not beginning with a problem. We're beginning with God's vision, because that's what we see in Scripture. We see where God created first. We see where God created and it was good. So we're going to begin with the vision, and we're going to be grounding ourselves here in Acts chapter 11. So I'm just going to read a little bit from Acts chapter 11, starting at verse 19. If I were at my mom's church, she would say amen when you have it. But Acts chapter 19, we're going to start Acts chapter 11, start at 19. And so here begins the reading. I'm reading in the Message version. Those who had been scattered by the persecution triggered by Stephen's death traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, but they were still only speaking and dealing with their fellow Jews. Then some of the men from Cyprus and Cyrene who had come to Antioch started talking to Greeks, giving them the message of the Master, Jesus. God was pleased with what they were doing and put his stamp of approval on it. Quite a number of the Greeks believed and turned to the Master. And so here we see we're grounding in this scripture because in a multi-ethnic church literature framework, typically we often see Acts 11 lifted up as, God's vision of church, every tribe, every tongue, every nation. And we affirm this. But we think it's also important to lift up what's overlooked in that passage as well, namely the structure of the community and the power dynamics of the relationships in that scripture. Just to be clear, you see in the scripture colonized Jews who have accepted this liberating message from this resurrected Jesus, reaching out to their oppressors and leading them into what we're going to call throughout this entire thing, liberation community. We see this in Acts 11. We also see it in Acts 13. We see this pattern that that Paul uses as he begins his sort of first century church planning network, if you will. So a quote here from biblical scholar Ched Myers. As an educated Jew trained in Torah, Paul was empathetic with his people's struggles to retain their identity and group cohesion. The first century church was a minority community trying to forge liberation both for itself and for the oppressor majority. So in their book, Radical Reconciliation, Curtis DeYoung and Alan Bozek remind us that Jews who were oppressed ministered to Romans who are members of the oppressing group, and in hopes for reconciliation and liberation. So we're calling this vision of church liberation community with two key characteristics that we're gonna cover and come back to. One being that it is an intercultural community. It is about diverse people joining in very particular situations, very particular neighborhoods, about the work of, and this is the second characteristic, liberation. And when we say liberation, what we mean is overcoming systemic and cultural separation, overcoming injustice in particular places with particular people, and with really an emphasis on leadership from minorities, leadership from the oppressed. So that leadership in that liberating community is coming from the margins. So Tanya, if you would put up slide 1, we have a slide here that basically kind of goes through some contemporary definitions that'll help us to understand this vision that we're talking about. Can you get another one of these, because it's not working? Sorry, y'all. Let me get back to my notes here. Okay, so these are some definitions. So here we go. You got diversity, you have equity, inclusion, and justice. And typically one or two of these is valued in the life of the church, of a multi-ethnic congregation. In my experience, I've been a part of predominantly Black churches. I've been a part of multi-ethnic churches. It's been a big emphasis on either diversity or justice. And we want to really lift up here that really all of these belong. Diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, every single one belongs. And it's really hard. There's a tension there that you have to hold. All of these together is messy, okay? Because diversity may not look like justice. I mean, so that's what makes it community. That's what makes this whole stick with itness the real deal. There's really not a formula or a math, equation to help us get through it. But all of these need to be at the table if we're really going to be seeking towards this liberation community. So why? Moving along. So we find the purpose for creating liberation communities. Thanks, Tanya. I think we're good with this one. If you want to screenshot that, y'all, before she takes it off. Thanks. Why? So we find the purpose for liberating communities in the gospel. What brings liberating communities into existence is the good news. It's the good news that really supersedes, that replaces the lie that is separation, that is injustice. It's very important that we understand our why. So the contemporary word that we'll use for all of this is restorative justice. We believe that the gospel is about restorative justice. So what is restorative justice, Erica? I'm so glad you asked. So we're defining it, and I'm sure you can, several people have lots of awesome definitions, but we're just for the sake of this session going to say that this is a justice that seeks to work within particular particularities of place, of people, to repair harm, to return what has been stolen, to restore people to each other, to restore people to the land, to restore people to this idea of them being together and sharing in that place. And all of this, when we do all of this, then we are reconciled then to God. Right. So it's not really a crude inverse of relations and in terms of empire, but this is just really about being right relationship with yourself, right relationship with your neighbor, right relationship with your enemy, and all created things. So when we think about retributive justice, we're thinking about punishment and it being individualistic, but restorative justice is about inner healing and outer healing between persons in particular places. So we lift up John 1:14 here as another sort of beacon or scripture that can help us to kind of keep with this incarnational pattern. It helps it to become more concrete, where we see that Jesus puts on flesh, moves into the neighborhood, and so God comes here to be with us. So it is the work of liberating community to do this, to take a particular place with a particular group of people to be about that healing. So in understanding God's call for restorative justice, it's important that we understand what that means for us, for people who call ourselves Christians, for people who are disciples, if you will. And so that means in this restorative justice call that we are partners with Jesus in a committed relationship with Jesus, with each other, to join this movement of making all things new, of restoring restoring relationships and broken people and returning things that have been stolen from people. This is the work. The work is to participate in that. And so we're going to delve into how you can do that a little more in our point 3, just in case you're taking notes. So that's our first point. So I'll turn over to Brandon for our second point.
Hey, y'all. So we want to ask the question, well, if this is the vision, if the vision is restorative justice, and if the vision is about building liberation communities, what is the problem we face now? And so I want to spend a little bit of time deconstructing multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity, and how that shows up in church plants and in communities. And typically, just to jump right in, typically what we see in multi-ethnic, multicultural church plants, including those that don't even identify that way, is that it displays what we're calling in the title a colonialist way of being. In the context of our discussion, I want to define colonialism as policies and practices that demonstrate domination and exploitation of a minority or underserved culture, demographic, or neighborhood by a majority culture. Now, obviously, in the history of this nation, colonialism is tied to the intersection of race and class and other isms, but we'll focus there. And especially sort of that is exposed in terms of white supremacy, patriarchy, and wealth, and the interconnection of those is how colonialism takes shape in the history of this country. The word I want to really lift out of that definition is dominance. That's the real the real focus that I want to draw our attention to for our time together. In typical multi-ethnic, multicultural settings, there is a dominant culture that is foundational and that is considered the standard by which everything is measured in terms of truth, in terms of beauty, in terms of morality. That dominant culture in America and in American religious communities has tended to be white culture or male-centric culture or consumer culture, or all three interconnected. And these dominant cultures are created and sustained by detaching from concrete places and spaces and the gifts and challenges of those places. You can maintain a culture of dominance by severing people from the wider neighborhood ecosystems that shape their lives. Rarely is this named as such, which is why colonialism continues, one of the ways that it continues to live. And so, yes, white folks, straight men, and wealthy folks have to be especially vigilant about colonialism because of this history of conscious and unconscious formation. But all people really have to keep watch for this principality and power, which can join any desire to dominate, really any craving to have more at the expense of a neighbor's well-being. And I think it really forces us, as Eric and I were preparing, it really forced us to ask this question and to really face the fact that there's this empire colonialist anxiety that keeps us from facing the sickness of domination. And it raises a lot of questions. What has happened in the history of our families and neighborhoods and churches that make us anxious about and disbelieve living into an Acts 11 liberation community where those who have historically been locked out and rejected actually lead us faithfully into the kingdom of God? What did your ancestors do to become white? What happened in history that made, for example, straight men presume that we need to be in control? Why do these principalities and powers still have such an allure on us in explicit and implicit ways? And ultimately, the question is, do we want to be free? I'm reminded of that passage that says, whom the Son sets free is free indeed. Do we really want to be free? Because what we have is these scripts that in many ways is in the air that we breathe, these scripts of domination. And yet what we see in Acts 11 is this beautiful vision of healing the broken places, repairing what has been stolen and where there has been harm, and living into a new way of being where we can be together. And that's beautiful, and that's a gift that is offered to us that we can actually receive. And the question is, do we believe that, and are we really looking to receive that gift from God? So I want to transition here to a slide, a tool that you can use. It's a power map. We learn about power maps in particular from the field of community organizing and activism. And I want to ask Tanya to lift up that slide. Give us some time to get it there. And so what this tool does is it helps expose what are the ways that our church, that in terms of policy, in terms of practices, is reinforcing systems of domination. And so I want to we can think of lots of examples of, systems of domination. Eric and I were brainstorming about one that would be pretty applicable to lots of folks. And so we want to lift up gentrification and displacement as something that church plants grapple with on a regular basis, and frankly is a common challenge that exists in places where revitalization and renewal is happening in local communities. So let me get this slide pulled up on my end here. Okay. So I'm not going to work through all of the bubbles here, but the idea, I want to give you a sense of the idea so that you can use this tool with your teams, with your leadership back in your community, to see what are the ways in which perhaps we are reinforcing colonialism through, for example, the problem of gentrification and displacement. And so I just want to sort of give a general sense of how this works. So in the middle, you name the problem. And in this instance, it's gentrification and displacement. And in the first outer rung of circles that are right around gentrification and displacement, right around the problem, you name some of those practices or policies, or some of the history of your faith community, of your multi-ethnic faith community, that reinforce that problem. And so we lifted up some here that we've both experienced in multi-ethnic settings, or have seen multi-ethnic churches struggle with, to fight against. And so I'll give you an example here. Like, a multi-ethnic church plant decides to engage in a ministry of feeding homeless folks, right? And then how that reinforces gentrification is that the volunteers that show up for that local homeless feeding ministry are primarily folks who drive in to help. Right. And then what sustains that local homeless feeding ministry is a partnership, perhaps with suburban and rural churches. So all of the leadership, all of the energy of addressing that need or addressing that issue is coming from outside of the community. And so are we actually seeking to end homelessness, or are we seeking to have folks come in to help sort of meet a need immediately and then perhaps leave and not actually engage in those relationships and actually bringing about repair and restoration to the actual issue? Another example that you'll see there, right outside of to the right, I guess it'll be your left, of the local homeless feeding ministry that is funded by a county rep that's a friend of the volunteer base. And this is really tricky, and I've seen so many examples of this where, let's say that county rep is a funder who voted for a ban on banning panhandling in the city. You see how that becomes really murky in terms of whether or not our faith community is actually getting to the root of the problem. Are we actually living into liberation community, or are we engaging in colonialist practices that actually strip people from getting to the source of the problem, and centering folks who have the solutions because they're most proximate to the problem and the challenge at hand. So I just wanted to, we don't have time to go through all of it, but I want to take some time with that, snapshot it, screenshot it now, because we're gonna shift gears here. But this is a kind of tool that helps you to not feel debilitated in reflecting and discerning on the ways in which you may perhaps implicitly, perhaps explicitly be reinforcing systems of domination.
So take it back to your team and put it on the whiteboard and go with it. Go with it, pray through it, all of that. And it might get a little hard, but that's all right. That's all right. So shifting to number 3, thanks to shout out to Tanya, who is like keeping us on point with the time. So going on to number 3, scared. So we're going to talk about what are those ways that we can shift from colonialism to community. How are we going to get to that liberation community that I was talking about in number 1? And so we're going to talk about 7 shifts. We don't have time to really go through in depth into each one, but we are going to try to give you a little overview of how we can start getting there. So Number one, we're going to talk about moving from this colonialist perspective of scarcity to abundance. And when I say scarcity, what I mean is colonialism teaches that there's not enough, right? That there's limited resources, limited time, limited room, there's limited everything. And so there's a constant feeling of threat, of defensiveness, of othering, of exclusion, of whoever is not saying what I'm saying, believing what I'm believing. And so this evidences itself in multi-ethnic context in two ways, more than two ways, but two ways that we'll lift up are assimilation and this, what we'll call quintessential complex. But assimilation really is, I think that we can all kind of picture what that is. That is, there is a dominant culture, there is a dominant foundation, there's a dominant measure by which everything is basically falling into line. Leadership, theology, culture and arts, right? Everything, and usually, unfortunately, usually in this country, historically and now, that dominant sort of foundational piece that is the measure is white culture. And so a lot of times when you're in the multi-ethnic context and you have assimilation going on, you really just have diversity, right? You just have people who look different, maybe drive in from different places, and are really just assimilating. And the other thing we want to lift up in terms of scarcity, this scarcity complex is something that I'll call quintessential complex. We were trying to think of a word yesterday that what covers this. And basically, when we say quintessential complex, it's sort of similar to assimilation, but it's sort of like where it thrives from a place of scarcity because, frankly, when you have snippets of culture, right? Snippets of Black culture, snippets of Latinx, snippets of Hispanic, snippets of all of these cultures, it's still from a place of scarcity because it's not all of the culture, right? It's not with this history of this people that has been snippeted and McDonaldized into a nugget for us to like consume so worshipfully in service, which is not what we want. We want to bring all of these histories and people and their pain and their stories that then can lead us to Jesus in a way like we would know if we just seeing snippets, right? So those two things are what I'll lift up about this scarcity, this idea of scarcity that colonialism kind of has a hold on. But then we want to move from that. We want to move from that to abundance, right? Abundance meaning that we are trusting in God, that there's enough. That God has provided. And when it seems like there's not enough, then we need to start asking questions. We need to start saying, okay, there's some injustice here that is making us feel like, what is making us feel like we don't have enough? How are we going to repair that? How are we going to return what's been stolen? We need to realize that something's been stolen. Okay. We need to put at the center of at the center, we need to put at the center what's been forced to the margins. So some practices here, right? Practicing abundance, finding the gifts and assets of all of our neighbors, right? So we have neighbors. We love our neighborhood. We live right off downtown. It's hood, but we love it, and we have leaders that people in the community know as leaders, and then there are leaders in the community that would not be seen as leaders. So we have a trans woman that is a sex worker right up the street, but a very, very committed and well-loved leader in her arena. And we want to know her. We are getting to know her. Her name is Tinkerbell, and she is very adamant about us calling her by her name. And so I'm so thankful for that. So, finding the gifts and assets of all of your neighbors, not just those who are lifted up as leaders. And then another way to live it out practically is we have mutual prayer partners, right? So we go out, we share our prayer requests on our prayer walks with our neighbors. We share with them what we'd like them to pray for, and they share with us. And so then we are increasing our prayer partners. Remembering that first slide, we're trying to be about diversity, yes. Equity, yes. Inclusion, yes. And justice. All four of those things is hard and messy, but that's where we're trying to get to.
And then a second shift is from numbers driven to relational impact. And what this really means is an emphasis on production and quantity in terms of number driven, and rather what we are advocating for and living into a more liberation community is having relational impact, where you get into these shared life together in a particular place where folks have a rich history of engagement and challenges and gifts within a particular neighborhood. And so it's important to name that shift from number-driven to relational impact. And I'll just give one example because for the sake of time. I think, we just started up a community garden in the neighborhood. And what that has been is an opportunity for us to engage with folks that, intergenerationally, that normally we wouldn't actually have together, right? And if we were only about numbers, being about numbers driven, we would primarily want to draw people out from this place in order to engage them. But this garden has become a touch point for folks that are curious and interested in what it might look like for us to grow food. And so we get a chance to talk to folks that we normally wouldn't talk to, that wouldn't show up at a religious service where we're talking about both the ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so these are so many. And you know what? We're up for email exchanges and for just growing our network of people who are trying to do this work and be about restorative justice. So we're going to shift because we don't have time to talk about all 7 of these. But we were more than willing to take questions. I think Dan might have some questions to ask. So yeah, we'll shift to Dan.
Hi, friends. Good stuff going on there. I really appreciate your thought, Brandon and Erica, into what you're doing on the ground. I've really grown to have a lot of affection for what you're doing and how it is messy. You said that in the beginning, Erica, and you're really laboring for the kingdom of God. And so I've got a few questions just hearing what you're saying, and also from my own experience around church planning and how this works out on the ground. Some of those questions, the first one would be kind of related to numbers driven or relational impact driven, that shift. As a church planter, I know this from experience, but I know others will probably relate with this. There's a lot of pressure to get to a sustainable sized church just to make it. So there's a pressure, there's an undertow of numeric growth. How do you see these shifts from colonialism to community affecting growth and expectations on a church plant?
I think, as Eric and I talked about this, I think that we've had to be really intentional about naming the fact that the pace is slow, that it's slow. It's about going deep. It's about engaging an intentional community. And so, I know that planters don't always have control. Most of them don't have control over those metrics and outcomes that are expected of them from networks and denominational offices. But I think it's important to be bold and courageous about naming where, if you can negotiate, naming the fact that you desire to do that work. In our experience in engaging with we're United Methodist, the state of the church is such that folks are hungry for something that will last, and really looking for quality and not so much quantity these days. Yes, there's always that lurking in the background because there's usually an upfront investment, but I think that folks really hungry for that. So for us, it's meant advocating strongly in both of the settings where we planted churches, advocating strongly for slower growth, being honest about the timeline, making sure to include that kind of space and pace within our work so that we can actually engage deeply and not feel like what we're doing is franchising something, but it's actually leaning into intentional community. And that include, in order to stand up in that kind of way, I mean, there has to be an acknowledgement that that's the intention, and a belief that that's the way we move forward. And it involves at least some level of sacrifice and being willing to stand up and advocate really strongly. We've had to do that. In terms of kind of practical things, I'll name one or two. And then, I think for us, we've had to acknowledge that in that slower space, we actually have the gift of beginning to engage in those liberating relationships. And so it allows us to do things, for example, like not just rely on demographic reports and market analysis to know our neighborhood. We actually get out and talk to people.
Right on.
We actually get out and to all the people, and especially centering people who don't get listened to. That takes time. And frankly, there's usually some level of suspicion from folks when you first move in, or even if you've been in the neighborhood for a while, you're starting a new project. So it's really important to be honest about the fact that this is slow work. It's slow, it's deep. It's going to be taking steps forward and taking steps back. I think that's really important.
Part B to that question is, how does that affect your ego, the slowness?
A lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a constant. Let me back up. Let me back up. Let me say that. Let me remind myself, and sometimes I'm reminding Brandon. Sometimes he's reminding me. That's not what we signed up for. We did not sign up to come in and do some quick gather. Put people together, because I love music, I love worship, I love some good singing, I love some dynamic preaching. But here's the thing, once people come to that and consume all of that, it's proven there's nothing really holding people.
Yes, together. Which actually leads to my next question, Erica.
Hey, can I just say one
go for it. Yeah, go for it, Brandon.
Another thing that I think is really important is that there are already faith communities and nonprofit folks, and there are healers in the streets in these neighborhoods that we need to be willing. This is something that we practice consistently when we planted new faith communities, is that why do we need to do something that folks are already doing really well, or where folks are maybe struggling to sort of bring sustainability to that? Why don't we support that? What's much more rare is having the bandwidth to be able to do the slower, deeper work of engaging. That's going to benefit. That's going to benefit everyone.
Yes.
So I think that is another way to challenge ego, is that when you meet newer people, when you meet folks who are already doing this work, you're humbled by it. You're not in your own silo where you feel like you got to provide the solution.
Yes. That's good. So. Also, my experience, I've been to quite a few multi-ethnic conferences, and it's not said, but it's between the lines, that if I had enough money and enough resources, I could hire a diverse staff, I could hire a great diverse worship band, I could roll out programs for the different felt needs of different ethnic groups, and I could potentially have a multi-ethnic church in a year or two's time. Without money, without resources, it seemed, when I came away from those conferences, it seemed near impossible for me to actually have a multi-ethnic church. Where would you start practically in gathering as a liberating community? Where do you start in the gathering process?
There's people already doing it. Find them, pay attention to them. There's, actual people, not demographic reports. You're going to have to go to where people are gathering on the front porch of that old abandoned place, that old abandoned house that's boarded up, but you see people there every day. That's liberating community. They ain't going to keep coming back there for nothing.
Right.
So, you got to go to those places, and then you do likewise. They're fostering a type of community that people are feeling like they can be their truest, like, this is who I am, and I can keep coming back here. There's something there, and it's Jesus. In my opinion, it's Jesus. And so we have to find that. And then I think another thing is acknowledging that that's what you want, acknowledging that you want those kind of parameters. You want this kind of community. And so you need to put into place parameters by which you can be held accountable to actually live in that way. So I mean, we look, we have friends that have come to be in the trenches with us here, and we are so thankful, because there have been times where we've been like, whew, man, this would be so much easier if.
Right. Yes.
But then you have people who are like, actually, no, this is what we're called to. This is what we're called to.
Yes.
The other thing I'll say too is that, like, on those porches and in those community centers and at those churches that have a long history of holding the torch of restorative justice, the gospel in the communities, that, like, there are ways in which to connect and plug in or to take action around mission in a place that you develop new relationships. That said front porch, said faith community, because there's relationship and there's equity and there's reciprocity there, being humble enough to just straight up ask, like, yo, like, can we link up with this person to, like, what's wrong with that? Again, it's checking the ego. But again, if this is about liberation community, about us all being healed and moving, we might be moving in different streamlets, as one leader in this community says, but we're all flowing into the same river and the same stream, right?
That's good.
Rather than just kind of it being about my thing. And so yeah.
That's good. I have one more question for you, and then we'll get the joy of taking questions from the attenders. From my experience, again, as a white dude, if you guys can see my face.
Yeah, you're white then. That's
right. I come to this with a certain script, a very consumeristic script. Growing up in a colonizing approach to being the church, and I needed more than just to read books. I needed to be rediscipled and retrained in proximity. My body needed to feel that process, and also marginalized folks, Black and brown folks, also come into community with a script. And they have seen consumerism, experienced consumerism, and maybe even bought into elements of colonization. And they need to be trained and rediscipled. But my hunch is that we come from different pathways, different angles. And so we need to be discipled from different vantage points or different starting points. I mean, that's just my hunch. How are you helping? Where are you helping to redisciple and retrain white folks and Black and brown folks into this beloved community, liberation community?
I think, I mean, I love what you point out, Dana. You've got these scripts, you've got these systems that have a long history to them, and we're all trying to buy out of them, and yet we do it in different kinds of ways based on our history and proximity to those systems of domination. And for Black and brown folks, again, if we believe that the gospel, I mean, especially that John 1:14 passage, that we find the liberating word in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the challenge, right, in the midst of where there's proximity to the pain the most. What you have is a history in Black and brown communities where you can always find sites of retraining and rediscipleship. There's always a remnant. And so I think that for Black and brown folks, it's finding those spaces. And I agree with you. That's not to say that folks aren't buying into the scripts of domination in Black and brown communities, but there's always a counter narrative that exists because of the long history and legacy of seeking liberation community within our neighborhoods. For white folks, there's much more. There's much less of a long trajectory and history of that within white communities, precisely because of what it means to be white. And so I think for a lot of white folks, the question is like, what did my ancestors and what happened in my family that we needed to become white? Where did we get cut off from the opportunity to actually live into liberation community along the way? And I think a lot of what that will look like is facing the question of what it looks like to be healed from that white supremacy for white folks. And I also think that it looks like concretely, like you said, Dan, finding those sites in Black and brown neighborhoods, to follow the leadership, to trust the leadership of folks there, to be in relationship there, to be held accountable. I think that's what it looks like. And that's certainly what we're doing. We could name communities, faith communities here, nonprofit leaders, mentors that have been that for us. And we can name white folks who joined us in this journey, who've been willing to do that hard work of seeking healing from white supremacy and having accountability and trusting Black and brown leadership. So yeah.
Oh, so good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Yes.
anything to that?
You all are on fire. You're on a roll. Thank you so much. You shared such great content. So right now, I just want to, again, open this up for anyone who has questions. You can feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A box within the webinar window. And I think you touched on the answer to this question, but maybe there's more that you can unpack. One question we received is, what advice do you have for white folks who see and understand systemic racism and white supremacy and want to do something about it in their leadership roles and places of influence in the church and outside? What steps can they take? There's a narrative of being darned if you do and darned if you don't, among white folks. So such that if the speaker is saying, if I go to the inner city and serve, I'm the white person saving the day, but if I move there, I'm contributing more to gentrification. So what do you say to them? And there are many layers to this.
Yeah, lots of layers to it. Yeah. Eric, you want to start off? I mean, immediately for me, the question is, what do you want, right? What do you want? What are you doing? Who's holding you accountable in those processes? Here's the deal. My grandma said there are as many opinions as there are. I'm not gonna say the word. It's a four-letter word.
We all got one.
And so, my thing is, if you are going about this from a place of integrity, where you are both seeking that internal healing from white supremacy, confronting your own families, looking at your own history, and that's a long and slow journey. Again, it's not a fast-paced thing. It might look like going deep with your dad, for 2 years, right? But in the midst of that, you're seeking healing through that relationship, and you're out on the front lines following the leadership of people of color, fighting for justice in Black and brown neighborhoods. Right. I think that we don't have to. I mean, one of the 7 shifts is moving from a kind of abstraction to contextualization. That knowing your own context and being willing to not make this an abstract thing about those people who are talking about me here. Here's the deal. How are you showing up for the work in your own life and in these communities, and who's holding you accountable? Who are your spiritual ride or dies, right? In the midst of this, so that you know that that you're staying true to what it looks like to be pursuing liberation community. That's what I would say. Yeah,
and I would add to that, like when you have those relationships, when you start to foster and build more, you're going to be speaking for your brother. You're going to be speaking for your sister who isn't facing whatever that is that they're facing right now. So in your position of power, as Brandon said, the abstract, right? No, you know their name. You know their children. And so, no, we're just not going to just blow this off because we all sitting in our office in our cubicle. No, we're going to talk about this. And we might disagree, but I'm going to bring it into this space because these are my people. So I think another key point to that is making sure that you are actually in those relationships.
And last thing is, we didn't bring this up, but like caucusing is a really important tool. We learned this from the activist community. It goes back, has a long history to it. But it's important for white folks to get together in it with an accountability relationship with people of color, but for white folks to get together to actually press into this healing work from white supremacy in particular as one system of domination. So that may be one space of that community, that and accountability as you engage out on the front lines and not have to worry about all the he said, she said stuff.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really insightful. So what I hear you saying is that it's a work that starts from the inside and then moves outside, involving relationship and not just kind of being an external thing.
Absolutely.
Well, we received a related question around the value and the role of language and the choice of words in forming community. It seems like language here can be a significant barrier in fashioning a liberated community. Mm-hmm. What challenges, if any, have you found with language as you reach out to others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot. Like, it's very difficult, a lot of challenge. We are both master's educated, and so it is important that you never see any particular group as a one monolith, one group. Okay, you need to make sure that you are communicating with a person's a particular person, right? So big ups to V3 because we're learning about that, and we are, excited about V3 being bold enough to actually say, no, this is what church is, but you got to translate that out into everything, right? You got to translate that out into how you talk to your neighbor. So specific examples would be my backyard neighbor not really understanding. I'm having to understand my backyard neighbor's discussions about our community. and actually he has joy in discussing and talking, but I'm having to do some work within myself to understand him. And then, as we're having dinner together, which is a whole nother thing, right? So we're having dinner together, me and my backyard neighbor. That space is there so that I can then begin to understand him and begin to break down or translate, if you will, in my head, the language barriers that there are. And we're Black folk, right? We're Black folk. So I'm not talking literal language, different languages. I'm talking, we just have come from different backgrounds and so we speak a different language.
And I'll give a quick example here. Be willing to be corrected. I mean, like that's. Right. I mean, just be humble. Like I a dear brother in our community, who's from a Latinx background, challenged me in how I administered the sacraments in one of our gatherings, our community. And why the body got to be broken, right? Like but it's such. Is another and so he introduced some new language around the body of Christ, the bread of life for all who hunger, right? Like, be open. And maybe that may not be a scenario, depends on your theological background. The point is be open to correction. Mm-hmm. You're going to mess up. Right. Just be authentic, be real. People are drawn to realness. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. In your introduction and at the beginning of our time, you talked about the theme of white supremacy and some of these just power structures. I'd like to, we have a question here that's talking about how do we address the idea that the idea of local culture being in opposition to kingdom culture. It's just, that's a complex thing because, how do we define kingdom culture
exactly.
Within a history of colonialistic mindset? So how do you tease that out and then pastorally help people adopt kingdom culture and let go of local culture in cases where it may be in opposition and not gospel compatible?
Yeah, I want that whoever that person is to reach out offline. This is a longer conversation, and I want to be charitable and generous in how I respond during the short time we have. And let me just say it this way: we absolutely need to walk with people to identify the ways in which evil and brokenness and harm shows up in our local cultures. And that's what we've been talking about all along. We've called that systems of domination, right? We've called that colonialism. We absolutely are for that. And we walk with people and journey with people in relationship to expose that. And especially to have them expose it for themselves. So that, again, that's discipleship, right? But I think that we absolutely, it's not just about tearing down. You think about the gospel pattern of not just taking off, but putting on, right? Putting on the clothes of, you might call this the fruit of the Spirit. You might call this we're Methodists, so we call this the works of piety and the works of mercy and justice, right? I think that we absolutely need to do that. The thing I want to push back on, and I want to invite whoever gave that question to reach out a little bit more, is that I think that those questions around kingdom culture and local culture are contested ideas. And we have to really have hard conversations about what we really mean by that and whether or not actually it's a lot more murky and gray than we're willing to let on. One of the points about colonialism is really a fetishizing over purity culture and a fetishizing over dualism, right? Binaries in and out, black and white, good and evil. And really there's much more mystery. We can find God's restorative, liberating, transforming justice taking shape in the midst of every situation, the mundane, the extraordinary, what looks messy and local and heathen, God is bringing forth something in the midst of that.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. So important. And it's important to do that, that hard work, because people will sense that, you are not trying to sense God's, God's spirit, God's presence in them, and, walk away, or, that will be a person that will be even harder to become, go further in relationship with at a later time. So yeah, I would encourage whoever that is to reach out, because there's so much we could talk about. Yeah.
There are so many questions, and unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of them. So I'm going to try to squeeze these two into one.
Okay.
One, the question has come up: in a polarized society or politicized society, there's hesitation to engage in conversation at the risk of offending a person of color when that's not the intention. And clearly, on today's call, you've called us to do personal work and then to get into person-to-person relationship and to explore. So how do you advise someone in that? And then the other question would be, if you're looking to, how do you move people towards, from looking diverse to living in liberated community when it's 50% white and the rest is mixed with so many other ethnicities? And we just love to know, this person would love to know practical things that we can do together as well as within the community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The first one I think we already spoke to, but I'll reiterate some pieces there. I think it's important. It is a highly politicized time. Absolutely it is. And I think it's important that that we actually be in relationship, right? It's much easier in a kind of consumeristic colonialist structure to just spew out our opinions all over the place. It's much more difficult to engage in conversation, to engage in conversation. Are y'all still there? Okay, you're still there. Engage in conversation and be willing to take the risk. In my group facilitation work, we talk about permission to speak in first draft is one of our community agreements when we meet together. What that means is everyone's learning, right? Mm-hmm. I'm going to assume best intent, but we're also going to find ways to attend to impact. And so around that, with your intention, it's okay, you'll mess up sometimes. Mm-hmm. And it's best to do that in spaces, if you're new to these conversations, amongst folks who are at a similar place to where you are. That's the reason why we lifted up the importance of caucusing, because to always come into groups that are diverse, that have folks with different kinds of power relationships based on the situations in those neighborhoods, and always be causing harm over and over and over again, and that, it's just not helpful. So find ways to still away, to connect with folks that are where you are, and then to re-engage. I think it's really important. So that's what I would say to that question.
Great. Thank you so much. Erica, Brandon, you all have been fantastic today. Thank you so much for sharing. There's been a request for when is the book coming out? I know that's something for you to think about. We just want to tell everybody on the call, the replay will be available, so stay tuned into your email. Thank you, Dan, for the questions that you prepared. And we just want to say, for those of you who are on the line and are interested in church planting, that you might be church planters or you're curious about it, we encourage you to look into the learning cohort that the V3 movement offers, as well as the praxis gathering. These are, a year-round experience. The learning cohort is where you can dig deep into principles of missional planting, and then the praxis gathering is an event, an experience that happens in September, where we bring practitioners all around, like the Wrenchers, and they will actually be a part of that programming. If you like what you heard or you're curious about more, there'll be an opportunity to engage them there, as well as a even broader roster of multi-ethnic male and female practitioners who are on the boots on the ground and digging into these very challenging subjects. So thank you so much for being with us today. We hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care, y'all. Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Take care.